My name is Josh. I'm a third-year PhD student in mechanical engineering and materials science. And today I'm going to talk to you about playing with atomic Legos, more specifically two-dimensional nanomaterials. And because I'm a part of the Yale Energy Sciences Institute, I'm going to tell you about their energy applications. First, a little bit of brief background about myself. I'm from Massachusetts. I grew up on the North Shore. And in high school, I became really interested in chemistry. So I knew I wanted to study chemistry when I went to college. I did my undergraduate at Bowdoin College, which is in Brunswick, Maine. And it's a small liberal arts school. And while there, I studied German literature, but also chemistry. And my senior year, I worked in a chemistry research lab. And one of the cool things about going to a liberal arts school is there are no graduate students at a liberal arts school, which means that as an undergraduate researcher, you get to do everything that a graduate student would do. That means you design experiments, you conduct the experiments, you collect the data and analyze it, and then you can even potentially publish. After Bowdoin, I knew I wanted to pursue a career in research. Originally, I thought I might want to go into biochemistry. So I went to Boston to get some more experience in biology. I worked at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is a teaching hospital associated with Harvard Medical School. And I worked in a microbiology lab, and I studied genetics and human liver disease. It was a really rewarding experience, but I ultimately decided that my true passions lay in the physical sciences. So now I'm here at Yale, and I study materials science. You may not be familiar with materials science, and it's actually a field that sits at the intersection between chemistry, physics, and engineering. So it's an interdisciplinary field. And just to give you an example, in our group, so I have a background in chemistry. Our advisor, or the head of our lab, has a physics background. And we have 3 graduate students in the group who also are trained as physicists. We also have 2 postdocs and a grad student who are trained as mechanical engineers. And we have a grad student and a postdoc who are explicitly trained as materials scientists. So you can see just in our lab alone how interdisciplinary this field really is. And as materials scientists, we really seek to answer 2 main questions. The first is, what are a material's properties, and what are the origins of those properties? So for example, let's consider 2 metals, iron and titanium. We know both of them are quite strong, but titanium is a lot lighter than iron. And in order to understand why that actually is, we have to look at how the atoms are actually arranged within these materials. So if we look at iron, we see that the atoms are arranged in this cubic packing structure. Whereas with titanium, the atoms are arranged in this hexagonal packing structure. And it turns out that the difference in how the atoms are arranged within these metals, coupled with the difference in weights between the 2 atoms, leads to titanium having a much lower density than iron, which is why it's much lighter than iron. So as a materials scientist, once we know what a material's properties are, the second question we seek to answer is, how can we use those properties for a practical purpose? Or how can we modify those properties for a practical purpose? So to continue with the example, iron has been used for over 1,000 years for building, for transportation networks, and for common household items. That's because it's cheap, it's abundant, and it's very strong. Now, titanium, as I mentioned, is much lighter than iron, which makes it really attractive as a material. However, it's much less abundant than iron, making it way more expensive. As a result, it's only used in certain select applications. So for example, golf clubs are often made of titanium, the aerospace industry uses it, and it can be even used in surgical implants, like replacement hip or knee joints. So that's materials science in a nutshell. My specific branch of materials science concerns nanomaterials. So nanomaterials, very simply, are very small structures. And if we consider a 3-dimensional material, in order to be considered a nanomaterial, either one of its length, width, or height needs to be on the order of 1 to 100 nanometers. And one of the cool things about nanomaterials is they have different properties as a result of their extraordinarily small size. So if you took a block of gold and cut it in half, you would get 2 smaller blocks of gold that had roughly identical properties to the larger block of gold. And this would continue happening if I kept cutting those blocks in half. I would get smaller pieces of gold that all have the same properties. But when I get down to the length scale of about 1 to 100 nanometers, this ceases to hold, and now the properties of those small blocks of gold will actually change based on their shape and size. So we can see here an example of some gold nanoparticles, all in different shapes and sizes. And we can see from the scale bars that they're all roughly between 10 and 100 nanometers in scale. But it's really difficult to wrap our heads around just exactly how small a nanometer really is. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, if we take a single strand of human hair that's approximately 100,000 nanometers wide. A virus is about 100 nanometers wide, and if we look at the individual molecules of our DNA, the actual width of this alpha helix in the DNA is only about 2.5 nanometers wide. So nanomaterials are extraordinarily small. There's a large number of different kinds of nanomaterials. I study what are called two-dimensional or 2D materials. So these are layered materials consisting of layers stacked on top of each other, and each layer can be thought of kind of like a Lego brick. It's very difficult to break the layers in half because the atoms within those layers are very strongly associated with each other. But we can take two layers and put them on top of each other and they'll stick together, just like you can stick two Lego bricks together. But also the interlayer interactions are quite weak, which means that we can easily peel off layers from one another, just the way you can unstick two Lego bricks that you've stuck together. Now they're called two-dimensional because their length and width can be anywhere between 10,000 to 10 million times greater than their thickness. In fact, they're so thin that they're actually less than a nanometer thick. And does anyone have any guesses as to how many atoms thick these materials are? Any guesses? You can just shout them out. No ideas? One? Any other ideas? 5? 10? 20? Okay, we're going higher. Okay, so 1 and 5 are correct. So these materials are either between 1 and 5 atoms thick. So here's an example of 3 layers of a material called titanium carbide. This is a transmission electron micrograph. So what we're actually seeing, these white dots, are actual individual titanium atoms. So as we can see, each layer has 3 titanium atoms in it, and it's very difficult to see in this image, but there's actually 2 carbon atoms above and below the central titanium atom, which means that this layer is 5 atoms thick. And we can see here 3 layers stacked on top of each other. So the 2D material that you're probably most familiar with, as Matt alluded to, is graphene. Graphene is formed from single atom-thick layers of carbon atoms arranged in these 6-membered rings. And if you take many thousands and thousands and thousands of these layers and stack them on top of each other, you get graphite, which is the material in the tip of a pencil. And when you write with a pencil, what you're actually doing is you're exfoliating off layers of graphene and depositing them on your paper. So in addition to graphene, there's a large number of other different kinds of 2D materials or Legos that we can play around with. These include other layers which are single atoms thick. As I showed before, these layers are 5 atoms thick, and there's another class that have 3 atom thick layers. And one really cool thing about all these materials is they have layer-dependent properties, which means that depending on how many layers we have stacked on top of each other, we can change their electrical properties, how they interact with light, how strong and flexible they are, and even what kind of chemistry we can do with them. So for example, this is molybdenum disulfide. This is a material that I study. So it's formed from a molybdenum atom bonded in between 2 sulfur atoms. And each monolayer is only 3 atoms thick, and it's actually 0.7 nanometers thick. And if we take a single layer, one single Lego brick of them, they actually are purple in color. So we see here, these are triangular crystals of molybdenum disulfide that I grew, and we can see that they're purple. But I can change their color just by changing how many layers are stacked on top of one another. So here's a bulk crystal that's had one edge shaved off, so we can see many different thicknesses at once. And as you can see here, the color changes from purple to the whole spectrum of the rainbow, just as I change the thickness of the material. So there's nothing's going on here. It's the same material. It's just different numbers of layers are stacked on top of each other, and we can change how it interacts with light to get a rainbow spectrum. So this is cool, but why do we actually care about 2-dimensional materials? What are they actually useful for? Well, it turns out that they have a lot of attractive properties which can be used for solar energy, for making renewable fuels like hydrogen. They can be used in batteries like lithium-ion batteries, which power most cell phones and computers. And also the electronics, which work as the brains of almost all the electrical gizmos and gadgets that we use nowadays, have very tiny circuits in them. And 2-dimensional materials can be used in those circuits. So all these materials have attractive properties, but no single material does it all. And all of them have some negative things that we don't like about them. And one thing we can do as material scientists to try to mitigate or alleviate some of those drawbacks is to form what's called a heterostructure. So this is a really cool thing about 2-dimensional materials. Because the layers interact with each other very weakly, we can take 2 layers of different 2-dimensional materials and stack them on top of each other to form a new hybrid material called a heterostructure. Kind of like taking 2 different colored Lego bricks and stacking them on top of each other. And Heterostructures are really cool because they can have just a combination of the properties of the two layers that make them up, or they can have emergent properties. That is, the properties of the heterostructure are different than what we would expect just based on the properties of the individual layers which make it up. So here's an example of a heterostructure that I made in the lab. What we see here, these two purple flakes are actually bilayer flakes of graphene. So there are two layers of graphene, so they're only 2 carbon atoms thick. And then this flake here is molybdenum disulfide, maybe 5 to 6 layers thick that I laid on top of them. So the way we actually use heterostructures in our lab is we try to make renewable fuels with them. So as Matt was talking about, hydrogen is a really attractive renewable fuel. And as he mentioned, we can make it by splitting water. We can zap water with about 1.2 volts of electricity, and we get oxygen and hydrogen gas. And as he mentioned, there's 2 parts to this reaction. There's an oxygen evolution reaction and a hydrogen evolution reaction. And we're interested in the hydrogen evolution reaction. So this reaction takes 4 protons and reacts them with 4 electrons, and we get 2 molecules of hydrogen gas. And if we use molybdenum disulfide as a catalyst for this reaction, we have to apply somewhere to between about 0.1 to 0.6 volts of electricity to get this reaction to proceed to actually make hydrogen. Now you'll notice that this reaction involves electrons. That means electricity. So in order to have this catalyst work, we need to apply electricity to our catalyst, which means that we need some sort of way of getting electricity into it. And traditionally, we would use metal, like you would in any kind of circuit or wire to have electrons flow. But the problem is, at this interface between, for example, gold as a contact material to our molybdenum disulfide catalyst, there's actually a wall for electrons, an energy barrier. So when we push energy into this system to try to make hydrogen, all we're doing is we're trying to push electrons over this wall, which means that none of the energy we put in goes towards making hydrogen. And as a result, you can see for modest applied voltages or energy inputs, we basically get no hydrogen out of this catalyst, which is a problem. So one thing that we did was we swapped the gold contact for a 2-dimensional contact. So we made a heterostructure between tungsten ditelluride, which is another 2-dimensional material, and molybdenum disulfide. And this heterostructured contact does not have a wall for electrons at the interface, which means that now all of the energy we push into the system goes towards making hydrogen gas. And as a result, you can see for the same amount of applied energy, we get a huge increase in the hydrogen that we get out of the catalyst by using the heterostructured contact. So that's just one example of how we use heterostructures in our lab to improve energy storage technology, either by making renewable fuels. We also are interested in intercalation chemistry, which is the key chemistry which governs how lithium-ion batteries work. So with that, I'd just like to conclude by thanking my advisor, Professor Judy Cha, and our whole research team. And of course, also our funding agencies. Someone has to pay the bills for all this research. In our case, we're funded by the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, the Army Research Office, the Department of Defense, and also the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for your time.
In a battery, why is there plus and minus?
Oh, so batteries work, lithium-ion batteries work by actually shuffling lithium from one side of the battery to the other. And the two sides of the battery, one is called the anode and one is called the cathode. They're 2 different electrodes. And the anode is traditionally the negative one, and the cathode is the positive one. So we're just shuffling lithium ions back and forth between the 2 sides of the battery, and they're labeled plus and minus because it's based on electricity, and in electricity and electrical engineering, we use plus and minus to denote different charges.
When you attach 2 Lego bricks together, do the atoms merge or do they stay apart?
No, they actually stay apart. It's the interesting part of them. There's a gap between the layers, and they interact with each other via something called intermolecular forces. So effectively, the two layers stick together, but very weakly. They don't actually form any chemical bonds between the layers, which is why we can peel them off from one another, and also why we can make heterostructures, because we can just stick two layers on top of each other. They just kind of weakly adhere to one another, but they don't actually bond to one another.
If they're not chemically combined, what holds them together?
Right, so it's something called van der Waals forces. Roughly we can think, so every chemical has electrons in it, and those electrons move around at really high speeds. And at any given time, they can be anywhere around the molecule. But if you think of just pausing time for a moment, and you have two molecules that have electrons, at one point in time, those electrons might be hanging out on one side of one atom and on a different side of another molecule, excuse me. And that will create effectively partial charges that then they just stick together via electrostatic forces. And they happen very dynamically, very quickly over time, so it's effectively an averaging effect of a very quick process. It's called van der Waals forces.
So how many combinations can you possibly make with all these Lego bricks?
Oh, so a lot. So there's, well, specifically for the class of material that I make, there's about 40 different two-dimensional materials you can make just in general. And then I don't know, there's probably maybe 40 or 50 different two-dimensional materials that you can make. And then any combination of those that you can think of, you can stack them on top of each other. And it doesn't just have to be a single junction. You could have 3 different layers stacked on top of one another from different materials. Or you could have different thickness layers. So you could have a single layer of one material with then maybe 5 layers of another material. So it's kind of an infinite playground in how many different combinations you can come up with. Yeah.
Are the layers electrically bonded?
Depends on, well, they're not really electrically bonded to one another, but they can conduct electricity between the layers. Depending on whether the layers are conductors or semiconductors or insulators, you can actually build electronic circuits from heterostructures. So graphene, for example, conducts electricity, whereas another material called hexagonal boron nitride is an insulator, so it does not. So you can actually build circuits with them.
Other questions for Josh?
How do you actually make them? I think I heard a story about Scotch tape, but I don't know if this is what you actually do.
Yes, so there's 2 ways we can make 2D materials. The Scotch tape method, which was famously used to first discover graphene, is you can basically take bulk crystals, so many thousands of layers stacked on top of each other, and effectively you can use Scotch tape to peel off individual layers from these materials, and you can get very thin layers. This works really fantastically for graphene. Graphene's really special. It's really easy to get monolayers and bilayers with tape exfoliation. For other materials, it doesn't work as well. We can also do chemical synthesis, so we can actually synthesize